Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming today for our talk on the last audience of the Hapsburgs by June Koehler, who's an assistant curator at the museum. We have a really exciting year this year because as much as we regret that Larry Fong retired, and we wish him all well and are still engaging him in projects, we are really excited because this year we've used funds from Larry's position as well as some of our new Neville funds to create 3 new positions that started off as externs at the museum and have now kind of given the amount of work and the quality of work that we make these externs do, we are now making them assistant curators for the rest of this year. But June is one of those. Han Shu works with Anne Rose with the Asian collection and has been doing wonderful work on an IMLS grant that we have on Asian conservation. And Jessie DiTilio is working as our exhibitions coordinator and also serving as a curator of a Kara Walker exhibition that we will be having starting in January next year. So they have really wonderful projects. June, we've been throwing everything at June, but including working with staff and James Harper in the art history department on creating our new European gallery upstairs in the McKinnon Gallery, which is really our first dedicated space for European art, which allows us to put up on a long-term basis paintings like this one. So not only did she kind of help develop and implement that entire project, but she has had many others that she's worked on both in American and European art and Latin American art, and her ability to work in all these different fields and manage the rest of us to keep us on track, and her ideas, research skills, everything else are just a great boon to this museum and to the world of museums and art history. So June came to us from traveling around the world, really, with your family, and you'll see that in her CV, because she received her BA in Visual Arts with a concentration in photography from the University of North Georgia in 2008, and then she moved to Spain, where she completed a BA in Spanish at the University of Granada, and then she came to us, where last year she earned both her MA in art history as well as her museum studies certificate from the University of Oregon. Her thesis examined how popular art forms from the Baroque period in Catalonia informed the 1930s leftist propaganda of the Spanish Civil War. Her research is informed by the fields of psychology and sociology, and she considers how collective remembering impacts cultural production in general and political propaganda in particular. She's especially interested in how these ideas play out in European and Latin American modern and contemporary art. As I said, she started working with externships here and has now progressed to all different kinds of curatorial practices. We just returned together from a 2-week trip to Mexico, where we were doing reconnaissance work with others in the community on how we can develop stronger ties with Mexico for cultural practice, both in terms of sharing or trading exhibitions and acquiring Latin American work. So not only did her Spanish skills come in extremely helpful, but also her knowledge of Latin American art and cultural practice. So I think you've got a real treat in store today, so please join me in welcoming June.
Well, thank you, Jill, for that very kind introduction, and thank you all for being here this evening. I'm happy to share with you what I know about this piece. When I came in this morning, our security officer, Carrie Wade, advised me to start with a joke. I don't have any jokes about this piece, but I did want to share with you a peculiar story in recognition of the sort of oddity of talking about the aristocracy on May 1st. So as Jill mentioned, my research has tended to focus on leftist movements in the 1930s. So I wanted to tell you the history of that sort of most recognizable of revolutionary symbols and solidarity movements, the clenched fist. So some scholars suggest that the iconography of the clenched fist actually started in Assyria many, many years ago with representations of the goddess Ishtar, which is correct, but it doesn't really explain what it's doing so prominently in Western art and propaganda. So I'd like to tell you the story of how that came to be in the West. It started in the Paris Commune, which was a people's government that briefly ruled Paris from the 18th of March to the 28th of May, 1871. It's often cited as the first assumption of power by the working classes during the Industrial Revolution, which is interesting because 1871 is sort of at the end of what we know as the Industrial Revolution. So how did the people gain power? When France initiated the Franco-Prussian War, which there is called the War of 1870, there was a growing discontent among the working classes. The gap between the rich and the poor was never more noticeable than it was during these years, especially with food shortages caused by the war. So in addition to that growing sense of discontent, there were two additional provocations that caused the Paris Commune to happen. So first, in January of 1871, after a 4-month bombardment of the city by the Prussians, the moderate Republican government, which was called the Government of National Defense, sought an armistice with the newly proclaimed German Empire. And part of the peace agreements for that armistice included a triumphal entry into Paris for the Prussians, which was incredibly upsetting for the citizens. Secondly, in the following month, February of 1871, the National Assembly elected a monarchist majority, which was also incredibly upsetting to people who were fearful of a restoration of the monarchy. So what this resulted in was an incredibly unruly class in Paris, hundreds of thousands of whom were involved in the citizens' militia. So what happened was they started gathering cannons together in the city and putting them in what they called safe places, which of course meant in the hills of Montmartre and other places where it would be difficult for the government to get to them. So in the spring of that year, the government had moved to Versailles to get away from Paris, but they decided it really wasn't safe to leave the cannons there, so they sent some French regular troops to seize the cannons from the citizens' militia. But the morale was so low at that time that the French regular troops joined the citizens' militia, and this caused an entire uprising, which was actually one of the bloodiest episodes in Western European history. I won't go into all the details, but basically the death toll was so high, and the people were buried in graves that were so shallow, the legend goes, that when rigor mortis set in, their fists came out of the streets in one last act of defiance. Now you can take that with a grain of salt, but I just thought I would tell you that in honor of International Workers' Day. And I promise it's not completely unrelated to what we're talking about this evening, because as many of you know, this painting that we're discussing is called The Last Audience of the Hapsburgs, meaning that this was the last royal audience that Empress Zita gave during her reign, and shortly after that, the monarchy crumbled. So I think the episode with the Paris Commune really gives us an indication of the kind of turmoil that people were experiencing, both in the working classes and the ruling classes in Europe at the end of the 19th and early 20th century. So I have quite a lot of information for you. I'm going to try to keep it brief downstairs, and then we can go upstairs and discuss the piece in the gallery. But we're going to talk about 3 broad things this evening. First, who's depicted in the painting and what's going on. Secondly, who began the painting and why isn't it finished? And third, how did it happen to end up in Eugene, Oregon? So we're going to look at all the people in the painting briefly. This main person here is Empress Zita. She's seated on her throne. Standing to her right, or her left, excuse me, is Helen Granich. She was a leader of the Austrian Women's Party in Austria. We'll talk about her more in a moment. These are her 2 bodyguards who later this evening escorted her out of Schönbrunn Palace, and she and her husband were later exiled shortly after the scene that's depicted in this painting. The people here are members of the court. And then we have the Organization of War Godmothers, which I'll explain later. These are women who lost their husbands in World War I, and these are their children. So we'll talk about the organization of war godmothers later and all of that. But for now, you have the stage set for you. So we're going to talk briefly about Empress Zita. Her full name is here. I won't repeat it for you, but there it is. She was born at the Villa Pianore in Tuscany on the 9th of May, 1892. She was the 9th daughter and 17th child of Robert I, Duke of Parma. Her mother was the Infanta Maria Antonia of Portugal. And now the way that she grew up is very interesting. So the Duke of Parma had been married previously to another Portuguese princess, Maria Pia. And because of their close blood relationship, they had they had 12 children together, and 3 of them died in infancy, and a number of the others were developmentally challenged. So the last of their children together actually died in childbirth as well, and Maria Pia died along with that last daughter. So after a few years, Robert, Duke of Parma, married again to the Infanta Maria, and they had another 12 children together. So Zita was the 3rd of their girls and their 5th child. So she grew up with 19 other siblings that had survived in the house. She was named after a 13th century saint who was the patron saint of servants, the pious, and the laboring poor. And she was really brought up by her parents to resemble the name that she was given. Every summer at their estate in Austria, the children would make an expedition to a textile factory that once a year kept remnants, and they would sell them to the poor. So Princess Zita and her siblings would go and collect these, cut them apart, and make garments, which they would then distribute to the poor. At their estate in Italy, where she was born, and Pianore, her sister Francisca and her would take pack horses, pile them with medicine, food, and clothing, and sort of run a route from their villa to the sea and distribute these goods among the people in the village. Now, despite the fact that charity was very important to her family, there was a fair amount of extravagance in their lives, as you can imagine. They weren't one of the major ruling families in Europe, but the Duke of Parma, who was the uncle of Henri Chambord, inherited a number of estates throughout Europe from his uncle. Now, what's interesting about Henri, the Duke of Parma's uncle, is that he was not just another Bourbon prince, he was actually the heir apparent. The Legitimists, or the royalists in France, called him Henry V and tried to get him on the throne of France throughout his entire life. So they lived in this palace occasionally. It was commissioned by the Francis I, King of France, in the 16th century. It's one of France's most beloved palaces, and the little Empress Zita and all of her siblings spent a great deal of time there. So now we're going to leave the Bourbon Parmas behind for a moment and look at the family history of Karl I, who Zita would eventually marry. So Karl's parents were the Archduke Otto von Habsburg. He was the favorite nephew of the Emperor Franz Joseph, and his mother was Princess Maria Josepha, daughter of King George of Saxony. Now, Emperor Franz Joseph had arranged their marriage, and it was a loveless one. They did not care about one another at all. Otto was a very handsome and charming young man. He was a favorite of Viennese society. And Maria Josepha, who I think is actually quite lovely, was ridiculed during her lifetime for her sort of stodgy looks, and she was from a very pious family, so she didn't really get along with Otto and his sort of philandering ways. But anyway, that's his parents. Now, what happened with his situation politically is that Emperor Franz Joseph had one son, and his name was Rudolf. In an incident that has come to be called as the Meyerling incident, Rudolf and his mistress killed themselves at his hunting lodge. And you'll see this is a portrait of Rudolph, and then that's his suicide note that he wrote to his wife, Stephanie. So this happened when Karl, who would later become emperor, was a little boy. And this left the emperor's favorite nephew, Karl's father, Otto, in line to become the next emperor. However, because Otto was somewhat of a cad, just like his cousin Rudolph, and had some mistresses on the side, Franz Joseph was afraid that something similar would happen with Otto, so he chose not to name him as his successor. Many of you may already know this, but the successor was, of course, Franz Ferdinand, who was Otto's younger brother. So that happened, that Franz Ferdinand was named as the successor. But shortly after that, he chose to marry a sort of unknown countess from Bohemia who was actually in the employ of his Aunt Isabel, who lived in the palace in Prague. So the family was not happy about this at all. But because Franz Joseph had been meddling in his nephew and niece's marriages for years and had come to feel quite guilty about this, he decided that he wouldn't discourage Franz Ferdinand from marrying Sophia, but that he wouldn't let a child of theirs succeed to the throne. So we're thrown back into Otto's family, and it's decided that Karl will become the next emperor. Franz Ferdinand went along with this and sort of appeased his uncle. However, it was never his intention to let Karl take the throne. His plan was when Franz Joseph died and Franz Ferdinand became the emperor, he would overturn his uncle's ruling and let his child with Sophia ascend to the throne. So when Karl does eventually become emperor, it's very shocking to everyone. Nobody thought this would ever happen. But at any rate, when Karl was a boy, because his father was off gallivanting around Europe and Maria Josepha was very interested in religion and education, he had a very strict childhood. When he went into the military at age 18 and then later went on to university, he sort of went along the way of his uncle Rudolph and his father Otto. So again, in a meddling incident with Uncle Franz Joseph, he decided to invite Karl over for dinner, ask him how things were going, and ask him if he would perhaps like to take a trip to Italy. So he arranged for young Karl to go to Pianore and visit the home of the Bourbon Parmas, where he hoped that he would meet and fall in love with the little Princess Zita, which is, of course, exactly what happened. So they became betrothed on the 14th of June, 1911. They were married in October of that year to much international fanfare. And in the following year, they welcomed their first child, a little boy named Otto, after Karl's father. The following year, they had a little girl named Adelaide, and by the following year, Zita was pregnant again. But before they could have that child, their idyllic life was interrupted on a date that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the 28th of June, 1914, which was, of course, when Franz Ferdinand and Sophia were assassinated in Sarajevo. So this forced Karl into the role of crown prince that no one thought he would ever assume. So in his years spent not paying a whole lot of attention at the university in Prague when he was being instructed on the very complex political system of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, he now finds himself ready to take the throne. So the interesting thing here is that he was most concerned about peace throughout this whole process. Despite the fact that it was his uncle and aunt who had been assassinated, as I mentioned before, Franz Ferdinand had no love for little Karl. He never intended for him to take the throne, and he was quite jealous of that situation. So there weren't a lot of personal connections there, but even in terms of family ties, Karl was very, very concerned with the sort of racial tones that started happening right at the beginning of the war. In August of that year, 1914, the German chancellor made a speech that in which he said that he was so glad that the world would finally see the Germans, and he used the German term that indicated a racial component there. The Germans would finally have victory over the Slavs. Now, when Karl and the rest of the ruling elite in Austria heard this, they realized for the first time that Germany was taking a direction here that was never really intended with the Austrian side. Over a third of their armies were Slavic peoples that were ready to fight for the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this was disturbing right at the beginning of the war. Despite all this, and despite the fact that he was to become the emperor eventually, he wasn't allowed a whole lot of time within, with Franz Joseph making decisions. He was sent out to deal with the armies, of course not fighting, but he was just out there with them. And so when Franz Joseph died on the 21st of November 1916, Karl was very ill-equipped to take control of the situation. But the day after his great-uncle passed away, he issued a proclamation in which he stated, quote, "I shall do all in my power to end the horrors and sacrifices of war at the earliest possible moment, and to restore the blessings of peace as soon as honor, the interests of our allies, and the cooperation of our enemies will permit," end quote. The rest of the proclamation was very, very long and included a lot of more specific details about what the plan was, but it's been suggested by some scholars that that sentence was the only one that Karl actually wrote by himself. And that continued to be his preoccupation throughout the war. He really, really was trying to end the situation. So he did not ascend to the throne in Vienna with much pomp and ceremony, but the Prime Minister of Hungary specifically came to Vienna and asked he and the Empress to come to Hungary to be part of the coronation ceremony in Budapest. Even though the war was going on, they felt like it was a really important show of support for the Hungarian people that they should come there. So this is an interesting painting that shows their son, the young Otto, coming out of the carriage dressed in Hungarian coronation robes for his parents' ceremony. And I've read some accounts of the coronation, and apparently the people in Budapest just went crazy for this little boy. He seemed to be this incredibly hopeful symbol of everything that peace could offer. So there was a lot of hope when Karl and Zita became the emperor and empress of the Habsburg Empire. But of course, we know that that didn't really end well. There were some secret peace negotiations between Vienna and Paris that Karl and Zita were heavily involved in during 1917. Didn't accomplish what they wanted to. It turned into quite a huge scandal, actually. And by the fall of 1918, it was a serious disaster. All of the parties of the Central Allies were beginning to sign armistices and just be done with the situation. So Zita gave her last audience to the war orphans, which is, of course, the subject of our painting, and shortly after that, the monarchy completely fell. So Karl and Zita were forced into exile, and Karl formally abdicated his Austrian throne on Armistice Day, which was the 11th of November. I won't read all of this to you, but the following day in Copenhagen, he issued this proclamation, which was published in newspapers all over the world. We have a copy of this in our files from the UK Times, so that's why we were able to have this. But again, what we see here is his incredible love for his people, and again, this interest in finding peace and healing. So just an interesting perspective on him. The couple made two ill-fated attempts to regain the Hungarian throne, which was encouraged by the Hungarian royalists, but ultimately their exile was permanent from the realms that they had ruled over. So after the second failed restoration attempt, they were removed to the Portuguese island of Madeira, where they lived in what for them was an impoverished state. Lovely little country house up there, but they were very dissatisfied with it. So Karl was wandering around the Portuguese coast one chilly morning and came down with a cold, which turned into bronchitis, which turned into pneumonia. And he died at age 30 on the 1st of April, 1922. Here are some images of the little archduke at his father's funeral, and then Zita and her 8 children without Karl. So it was a very difficult time for them. There's a wonderful book called The Last Empress by Gordon Brooke Shepherd. He did a lot of very detailed interviews with the Empress and with her son, but there's accounts of them, steaming dandelion greens. So really, in comparison from what they had been used to, this was quite a difficult situation. And the political tides in Europe at the time were completely against them, so there were very few people that would really come out in support of them. What's interesting is that later in life we see Zita's reputation in particular sort of have a turnaround. She was actually allowed to be buried in the Habsburg crypt in Vienna. So I'll just go back to this slide for a moment. This picture on the right is where Karl his remains are there except his heart. But she tried throughout her life to get his body moved to the royal crypt in Vienna, and it didn't happen. So in the 80s, when she passed away, there was a lot of sort of emotion worldwide that she was finally able to go back. But at any rate, we're going to turn back to the painting really quickly, and I want to tell you about the artist, who's was very famous in his lifetime, but he's sort of been not very well remembered by art history. But he was born in 1856 in a small agricultural town in Hungary, and his name is Artur von Ferraris. And again, as we've been discussing throughout the evening, the town that he was from and Hungary in general was part of a major reform movement in the mid-1800s. So in this case, it was an effort to oust the Hapsburgs from Hungary. The revolutionaries succeeded, actually, even though it was a very brief incident, in creating the first Republic of Hungary right around the time that this artist was born. Now, good old Franz Joseph called in the Russians immediately after that revolution, and they were squelched, and the Habsburgs were reinstated. But gives you an idea of what was going on at the time. So, at any rate, this was the Hungary that this artist grew up in, and he actually left for Vienna when he was still just a teenager, and there he was able to begin his art education. His first teacher was the Viennese artist Joseph Matthaus Aigner, who specialized in portrait painting. And interestingly, he was also a reformist and had actually been sentenced to death for high treason. He was later pardoned, but it's curious to me that someone who eventually would paint some of the most powerful people in Europe was first educated by a person who wanted to see a lot of that power redistributed. So von Ferraris didn't stay long in Vienna before he left for Paris, and that happened in 1876. So after settling in there, he began studying with two individuals, Jules Lefebvre and Jean-Léon Gérôme, which many of you may be familiar with. One of the most notable paintings that Gérôme is famous for is The Snake Charmer. Now, he was a very, very famous painter in his day, very celebrated, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with this work for a different reason. He's become sort of the poster child for the more distasteful aspects of Orientalism. So this painting focuses on this naked boy who's wrapped in this serpent, and there's this group of mercenaries that is staring at the boy, and this man who's playing the fiddle for him, or the flute for him. What's interesting about this piece is that there's obviously a level of realism that borders on photographic, but this scene would never ever have taken place. It's sort of a pastiche of all sorts of Middle Eastern and Near Eastern ornamentation. The garb that the people are wearing doesn't necessarily match the style of architecture that they would be seated in. So it's a mess. And I mean, we know these things now about Orientalism and the sort of troubling gaze that produced. But I wanted to share with you recently, an art critic published this in the Guardian about an exhibition that this piece was included in. He calls it, quote, "a sleazy imperialist vision of the East. In front of glittering Islamic tiles that make the painting shimmer with blue and silver, a group of men sit on the ground watching a nude snake charmer, draped with a slithering phallic python. This is a glitteringly cinematic slice of Orientalist fantasy. Gérôme was a pristine purveyor of high-gloss dreams. End quote. So what I want to point out to you in juxtaposing Gérôme with what we'll later talk about with von Ferraris is that not all Orientalist painters catered to this type of imagery. But I'm sure, as many of you know, the reason in part that Gérôme has become sort of the poster boy for this type of thought is because his painting, The Snake Charmer, was featured on not the first, not the second, but I think all editions of Edward Said's Orientalism. The newest one that they just came out with changed the image, but it's also one by Gérôme. It's called The Bather. So at any rate, so Gérôme was the one who encouraged his pupil to go to Cairo and paint there. But what we see about von Ferraris' pieces that are different from his pupils, from his teachers, is that they're meticulously detailed in that same way, but they're more intimate. He's often been compared actually to Degas. We have this sort of cropped image. This piece looks like it's perhaps something from a much larger scene. We have actually a doorway on this side leading to somewhere that we can't see, a doorway on that side, again, leading to somewhere we can't see. And the man is very introspective. Certainly that's not to say that there aren't some Orientalist trends here as well, but I think that you can see the difference between the type of work that Gérôme was doing and the type of work that von Ferraris is trying to accomplish with the same environment. Another work that he painted in the same year as the last one, The Learned Man of Cairo. This one is called The Coffee House in Cairo, which is also a really unusual work in terms of the type of Orientalist painting we're used to seeing. So ostensibly it's just a picture of a coffee house in Cairo, but there are a lot of things going on here that I find quite interesting. So the woodwork and the sort of crumbling tiles that we see around allowed von Ferraris to really highlight his work as an architectural draftsman, which we'll also be able to see when we go upstairs into the gallery to look at the last audience of the Hapsburgs. He has included a lot of really interesting architectural detail there, even though a lot of it is just sketched out. You can also see in sort of the practiced way that the gentleman in the back is pouring the coffee and this very relaxed manner that the man in the front is sitting in, that he probably spent quite a lot of time sitting in front of these people, sketching them. He probably returned daily to this coffee house to really, capture the detail. In contrast to some of Gérôme's works and a lot of the other Orientalist painters, he wasn't interested in painting this gloss or pastiche. He was actually a quite astute observer of local customs. And one of the ways that we know this is because that paper there actually has some information about political events at the time. So he wasn't trying to make some sort of timeless Oriental ideal. He's actually showing a particular scene, particular people, and really trying to make that apparent. What's interesting, too, is that he was a portrait painter, and he became particularly well known in Europe for having that sensitive eye and really noting detail, particularly in people's dress and costume. There's another set of works that I'd like to talk about really briefly, too. This painting on the left is by von Ferraris, and the painting on the right is by another very famous Orientalist. And this, I think, really encapsulates the difference between von Ferraris and other painters who were traveling in the Near East. What we have in von Ferraris' painting is really a portrait. He's looking at this woman, her dress, her particular physical characteristics. And then in the painting on the right, we see Luis Ricardo Falero. And I mean, even the titles are completely different. We have a lady here and then this enchantress. Her face is somewhat stylized. We don't know that this is a particular person. She's heavily ornamented. And then in one of the most interesting aspects to me, the lettering on the corner there is actually a Quranic verse that the artist has not faithfully written down. He's changed it, which is odd and somewhat distressing. But anyway, so when von Ferraris came back to Europe from his travels, he came back with a lot of sketches. He did all the paintings that I just showed you. He may even, given the times, have come back with some photographs of the subjects. But when he came back to the West, he was doing a lot of portrait work again as well. It was very economically expedient, and it helped him to, again, solidify his reputation. He continued to receive impressive commissions both in Europe and eventually in the United States, where he made several trips to New York and became a very fascinating member of society in New York after he painted a picture of John Rockefeller. So we're going to return to the painting for just a moment, and I'm going to answer our third question: how did this piece end up in Eugene? We know that von Ferraris was here in Vienna painting this picture in 1918. We actually don't have any idea when he died. We know it was sometime after 1928 because there are a few pieces of documentation that let us know he was in Vienna in the 1920s. Some people suggest that it was in the year 1936, but mostly it's an undisclosed time after 1928. There's no solid proof either way. So it came to Eugene by way of this woman right here, who I already told you briefly about, Helena Granich. And as I said, she was a very prominent member of the Austrian Women's Party. This article right here, which is quite fascinating, it was published in the Register Guard in 1962, tells us that she had to flee Austria because Hitler put a price on her head. I think that's a little bit salacious, but it is in fact true that she did get into some political trouble in Austria and felt that she needed to relocate for her safety. So a daughter of hers and a son-in-law lived in Portland, which is where she came. The painting was smuggled to her in the United States in a carpet roll. This happened at some point in her first little bit in the United States, where she stayed with a woman named Mrs. Ansbacher, who lived in New York. When she was able to get to Portland, she took the painting with her. She kept it in her closet for a number of years in Portland, and then as she got older, she became very paranoid that something was going to happen to the piece. So she asked a woman named Mrs. McCready of Eugene to take the painting and put it in the First Bank. Mrs. McCready agreed, and it was here for quite some time as well. And what's delightful about that is that Mrs. McCready was a member of the Friends of the Museum, which is a group that's no longer in existence, but we're very thankful to them. They're sort of a precursor of our modern membership program and volunteer programs and things like this. But they were a highly engaged group of people, and we can really thank them for bringing art to the museum, bringing people to the museum. People like Hope Pressman were a part of this group. But we can also thank them for bringing this particular piece to the museum, because when Madame Granich died, she left the painting to Mrs. Ansbacher in New York, who contacted Mrs. McCready, who organized the receipt of the painting here at the University of Oregon. One last little tidbit: it was unveiled on the 23rd of April, 1962. They had a party over in the EMU ballroom, and they apparently, according to the invitation, had the ballroom set up like the Schönbrunn Palace in Vienna, and they had food from the imperial courts of Europe. So I would have loved to have seen what that party was like. But anyway, I'd love to head upstairs and take a look at the painting. We can also do a few questions down here, or we can discuss it upstairs. Does anybody have a preference? Oh, yes. Okay. Yes. Oh, I did not know that.
Now, I don't know, that's from some notes I have in my docent files, but that's the story we got, but
Okay.
I don't have anything to back it up.
I'd love to talk to you about that later. I understood that her daughter was in Portland, but if you have a lead on some more information, that would be great.
I don't really have any more lead than that.
Okay. Yes? Did
So the painting was in a rolled carpet
you? Mm-hmm.
for how long? You know?
It was in the carpet in the closet for 17 years, and then I'm not quite sure how long it was in the bank. But I guess I could do some simple math. I won't now, but so it came to the museum in 1962, though, and until sometime when, so let's see here for a moment. Mrs. Gronich came to the United States in 1939, and then it was in her home in Portland for 17 years, and then at the bank, and then here.
And there was no damage from the
Oh, there was extensive damage.
Oh,
There,
okay.
we had to do a lot of restoration.
Okay.
Mostly there was sort of film of mold. Luckily it wasn't folded or anything because it was in a carpet roll that was large enough to accommodate it. It stayed rolled up quite nicely, but there was some problems with humidity and air and whatnot. Okay, I'm gonna go with John first.
Yes, you identified several of the people in the painting.
Mhm.
For the most part, the unfinished figures appear to be children, but there is one child who is a finished figure, so maybe you could tell us who she is and why she is finished.
I wish I could, John. No, there's a lot of questions that remain to be answered about this piece. It is certainly fascinating. He's referring to this child right here in the white dress, and then interestingly, there's also that sort of floating face of that adorable little girl with her bob. So I have no idea why those two children are finished. Unfortunately, again, because of the political situation that was happening at the time, I haven't been able to locate any sort of official mention of this audience even. So rather interesting. I'd love to be able to go look at some archives in Vienna, but maybe someday. Jim?
Judy may have mentioned this, but was this a commission painting?
That I don't know either. Because the artist was traveling so often, the records about his life are very incomplete. And then because, all of the European monarchies were crumbling at this point, it's very, very difficult to get any sort of record of what was happening in October and November in terms of the artist's career. We don't even have a catalogue raisonné on him. And in fact, the three books that have been published that have information about him are all collections of Orientalist works. So his portraits are less studied. Any other questions? Okay, yes, sir?
Why are the other children not finished? Did you just not finish the painting, or was there a specific?
So the story in the Eugene Register Guard, which I have not been able to confirm in other sources, but the story is that the artist fled after the fall of the monarchy, just a few days after this was started. I also have reference to a photograph that may have been taken, but that image has never been located. So basically, from what we understand, the artist sort of abandoned the piece at some point, whether that was for political reasons or whether he just went off on one of his travels and never reclaimed it. There's no answer. Okay, we don't know. No, we don't. No. Yes?
Is there a known photograph that he used to paint some of these faces at all?
There is reference to a photograph in the files, the object file that we have here at the museum. I have not been able to confirm the existence of that photograph, though. I haven't seen it in any books on the Empress's life or the artist's career, so it's difficult to say whether someone just thought there could have been a photograph or how that sort of came about. Lee?
There's an interesting family history that's been published. It's
Mhm.
called The Hair with the Amber Eyes.
Okay.
And it's about the Frusi family. They were Russian Jewish bankers who were headquartered in Vienna prior to this, and it follows the family as the empire implodes. And the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the number I remember was that from the book was that there were 36 million subjects that Vienna had control over, and then all of a sudden they were a country of 4 million. And there were rumors of civil war and chaos. So what went on when the emperor fell was just a symptom of the whole civil unrest. It's a fascinating book, by the way.
Okay, thank you very much. I'll take a look at that. All right, well, let's go ahead and head up to the gallery then. Thank you.